Thank you. Thank you for being here this morning. I know you could all have gone to TIFF instead, and I'm quite honored to have been asked to deliver the first lecture to the senior college for this year. My research specialization is the history of culture and ideas in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly the history of the social and behavioral sciences. And my talk today is drawn from my work on psychology and the culture of modernism in Canada and the United States from the late 19th century to World War II, which examines the ideas of behavioral scientists and their application and popularization. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the vexatious development of psychology at McGill in the interwar era. But my aim is to show how it's an example of the multifaceted ways in which the history of ideas can be undertaken. Yeah. The interwar era was a turbulent one for Canadian universities. World War I and the Depression fueled concerns about the role a university should play in society, the degree to which it should be responsive to issues beyond its walls. The National Research Council of Canada, formed in 1916, supported scientific research, but research for other fundings was available only through philanthropic organizations, primarily in the United States, or from businesses. At McGill, a private university in Canada's financial capital, these problems were exacerbated by the institution's strong utilitarian tradition and a board of governors drawn from Montreal's largest businesses. McGill was renowned as Canada's premier university in science and medicine, but the social sciences fared less well. After World War I, though, McGill took steps to develop them, persuaded of their utility to the university and the wider community. Within 10 years, however, they were at the center of a storm that raged over academic freedom, the legacy of which was to leave them fractured and subsequently viewed as marginal to the university's history. The social sciences had become the target of the administration's attempt to rid McGill of its reputation for social and intellectual ferment, perceived as emanating from the McGill Social Science Research Project, an interdisciplinary project involving McGill professors and graduate students in several departments and funded by the American Rockefeller Foundation. These twists and turns resulted from the concurrence of several developments, which I explored in my first book. McGill's traditions and policies, economic and political conditions affecting Montreal, and ideas that shaped the social and behavioral sciences. There were two intellectual currents at the heart of McGill's history: the tradition of utility, a distortion of the philosophy of utilitarianism, and the concept of efficiency, sometimes labeled as human, social, or national efficiency. Religious connotations infused the latter, the idea that society could be redeemed through the social sciences. The culture of modernism was another powerful current that played a part. As I will later elaborate, modernism emphasized flux and contingency and the role of chance and risk in human society. It buttressed technology rationalization and efficiency, but was also concerned about their impact on community, history, and memory. Now, the history of ideas is often dismissed for being centered on elites and insufficiently grounded in facts. This is an unfortunate criticism, as ideas are also subject to erasure and marginalization. And there is no better place to see this unfold than by studying a university's history within and outside its walls. Is the history of supposedly marginal disciplines worth pursuing? That's a question sometimes posed to the historian of ideas, sometimes making it a risky scholarly enterprise. In 1931, McGill political economist Stephen Leacock, also probably better known as a humorist, while serving on McGill's Art Survey Committee, surmised that one reason for the Faculty of Arts' lower standards and weaker reputation than McGill's scientific and medical faculties was that it drew students from the local community, from backgrounds he regarded as culturally impoverished. Many from the refugee population of Europe, he said, not illuminated by the Scottish Enlightenment. And towards the end of the 1920s and 30s, McGill took measures to control the influx of Jewish students. Quotas were instituted in medicine. In arts, Jewish students required a higher matriculation standard than others. In the aftermath of World War I, it was commonly believed in Canada, Britain, and the United States that the key to international stability was economic productivity, because a wider distribution of wealth and goods would minimize the chances for future conflict. This involved mobilizing a large part of a nation's resources for industrial development, eliminating wastefulness and inefficiency, and encouraging productivity. These beliefs grew from concerns that the war had heavily drained human and material resources because of its length and higher than innocent nationalism and wartime rhetoric that the great struggle would mark of a new. When enthusiasm for the war dissipated, these groups pledged to achieve their societal goals once it ended. And in an atmosphere that stressed the importance of productivity and economic and social reconstruction, much attention was given to child welfare, the prevention of mental disorder, charity, and relief. The cult of scientific management flourished, and universities picked up on the vogue to produce, quote, trained human doers, and implemented programs in applied science, vocational, industrial training. This drive for efficiency shaped the development of the social sciences, social and behavioral sciences in Canada generally, but the strongest impulse was at McGill. The war had created severe economic problems in Montreal, hampering the university's recovery from wartime disruption. Inflation and widespread unemployment caused social unrest. One prominent Montreal resident remarked, "Bolshevism was in the air." McGill officials feared that the high cost of living was going to prompt young professors to turn to socialism and communism. For its initial attempt to deal with the problems of unrest and create social efficiency, especially in charity distribution, McGill established a Department of Social Service, which then developed into a Department of Sociology. It also allowed for the expansion of the discipline of psychology. A 1935 article describing the beginnings of industrial psychology in Montreal, laden with allusion to Moses delivering the 10 Commandments, reflected all these impulses I've been talking about. It said, a dream existed in 1919 that psychology could be brought into close application to the business and educational life of Montreal. In the winter of 1919, Dr. W.D. Tate, head of the Department of Psychology at McGill University, returned from the war and, believing that psychology had a real contribution to make to industry, decided to take it down the hill from the university to the business world, which lies at the foot of Mount Royal, by offering university extension courses in business psychology. The class was attended by about 50 businessmen and women, including the author of the account, F.W. Clark. 6 years later, when Clark was hired to supervise unemployment relief in Montreal, which turned into the city's Protestant Employment Bureau, he contacted Tate about the lectures he had given in 1919 that dealt with intelligence testing for work placement. And to quote again, Dr. Tate immediately came down the hill again, with the result that the Employment Bureau was started with a definite psychological cast. Clark believed this was the first time anywhere that a free employment service used tests of intelligence and other abilities for the placement of workers. While psychology's development in the interwar period was part of the early 20th century drive for national and human efficiency, the reason for its phenomenal rise in popularity had deeper roots, I would argue, embedded in the emergence of modernism and its inherent contradictions. And this was an intertwining that occurred over a period that began in the last decades of the 19th century. Modernism is best understood as a set of beliefs, values, and modes of perception that came into being in the late 19th century as part of the process associated with modernization, that is to say, industrialization, rationalization, and efficiency, as well as in response to new findings in the biological and physical sciences, which led to the collapse of linear conceptions of time and space, and to the development of such notion as streams of consciousness. This is an interpretation that differs from treatments that link modernism to modernity in general, or associate it with the avant-garde movement of artists and intellectuals who expressed hostility to modernization, or else, particularly in the United States, regarded it as a celebration of technology. The New York Armory Show of 1913 is usually identified as the first example of cultural modernism in North America. However, intellectual developments in physics, biology, philosophy, psychology, and other fledgling sciences had established forerunners of modern thought before that. Already in the late 19th century, a group of social thinkers in the universities asked questions about human nature and the workings of society that resembled what later came to be called modernism. That is to say, their ideas no longer reflected a Victorian outlook that had been grounded in belief in the universe and an accompanying conviction that humans could arrive at a unified and fixed set of truths about all aspects of life. Instead, they questioned the notion of the fixed and final and started to abandon 19th century positivism for a view of a more open universe governed by chance and change. They no longer adhered to a dichotomy that separated what was deemed animal from what was regarded as human, a dichotomy that had polarized so-called civilized and primitive societies. I'm just going to get that off the screen. Maybe not. Where's the cursor? I'm just trying to get the cursor right there. Okay. Okay. While inseparable from the processes of scientific and economic rationalization occurring throughout the West, modernism was also concerned with the social impact of these processes on community, history, and memory. And this tension was evident in the social sciences beginning in the late 19th century, especially in what was labeled the New Psychology. The New Psychology dealt with the function of sensory processes and consciousness through laboratory experiment, rather than through introspection, which had been psychology's approach earlier as a branch of philosophy that dealt with mental life. And the 1920s saw the birth of another new psychology movement, engendered by the post-war desire to understand the roots of social and international problems. It turned against the seemingly dry academic approach of the earlier movement, which had largely eschewed practical application. It inherited some ideas from progressivism and social reform, and focused on the treatment of large numbers of people through mental hygiene, psychiatric social work, mental testing, personnel selection, and welfare practice. Supplementing wartime ideas of control through propaganda and advertising, control could now be exercised by the manipulation of inner need and individual desire. Immediately after the Great War, many psychologists turned their attention to social unrest, with some, like McGill's W.D. Tate, attributing strikes, lockouts, economic competition, and monopolies to inner drives. Such notions were products of another set of ideas that shaped the new psychology of the 1920s, biological conceptions of the mind, psychopathology, and attention to the role of unconscious motives in human action. Before the Great War, psychogenesis and psychotherapeutics were terms used to suggest that the mind was responsible for bodily states. But during the war, medical practitioners increasingly recognized the role of consciousness. When hospitals grew crowded with soldiers whose troubles appeared to be mental, many physicians began crediting emotions with a variety of powers, often using hypnotic suggestion or mental healing rather than drugs or surgery as treatment. Dalhousie University physiologist, Dr. David Fraser Harris, found it ironic, quote, that the Armageddon that produced such brutal force and suffering demonstrated the beneficent action of mind over the ills of the body. Before the war ended, medical publications which reported on treatments acknowledged the interaction of mind and body. A special journal, Psyche, devoted to non-material things, regularly advertised in the leading scientific journal, Nature, and Nature, in turn, reported on the transactions of the Metaphysical Society. With all it seemed to promise, psychology very quickly moved outside of the academy and came up against post-war fascination with spiritism and the occult. When speaking to public audiences in Montreal, psychologists found themselves answering questions about these subjects, though they often disparaged them. Now it's not working. In Canada, psychology was as old as its universities, though it was taught as philosophy well into the 20th century. McGill and University of Toronto established the first autonomous departments of psychology after World War I, but elsewhere in Canada, philosophy and psychology were not severed until the 1940s. The head of McGill's department was William Tate, who trained in experimental psychology at Harvard with Hugo Münsterberg. The head of Toronto's department was E.A. Bott. On arriving at McGill in 1909-1910, Tate established a psychological laboratory. During World War I, he joined the armed forces and went overseas, returning was Chester Kellogg, an American with a PhD in psychology at McGill, largely influenced by sources of research funding for their research by appealing to university officials and business interest. For psychologists, it also meant dealing with contenders, popularizers, and public misconceptions about psychology. After World War I, fascination with psychology exceeded the wartime popular interest in the mental hygiene and intelligence testing crusades. Abraham Roback, a McGill graduate who had become an eminent psychologist, noted in his widely acclaimed book, Popular Psychology, which was published in 1928, that it was impossible to read a newspaper without coming across the term. On stage, psychological plays were performed. In front of their fireplaces, people were reading novels and pondering the psychology of the hero or the heroine. The wish that had been expressed by Hugo Münsterberg 20 years earlier, that psychology might become the scientific basis of modern culture, now seemed near fulfillment. Leading scholars in numerous fields had become devotees of the discipline. Presidents, congressmen, and parliamentary representatives commonly diagnosed their country's ills as psychological. In his address to local Canadian clubs, Sir Auckland Geddes, British ambassador to the United States, described peace as a mental state, the recognition of law and justice, and the unwillingness to accept it as the persistence of a mental condition. In his book, Behind the Beyond, Stephen Leacock quipped about an outbreak of psychology that was sweeping across North America. Where success literature had once been concerned with honor, dependability, and courage, he said, it was now obsessed with inferiority complexes, neuroses, and conditioning. A great wave of mind culture swept through the community, he charged, and psychology professors were now wearing overcoats lined with fur and riding around in little coupe cars like doctors. A 1933 article in Atlantic Monthly, which took stock of psychology's post-war advances, was more critical. The author, Grace Adams, an American psychology professor who had left the discipline because of the lack of freedom at the Teachers College in Baltimore, where she worked, commented that the 1920s, instead of being called the decade of the dollar, should have been labeled the period of the psyche. Pioneering late 19th century psychologists could not have imagined how the meaning of science would change by the 1920s, she said, symbolized in the popular mind by the washing machine, the telephone, the motor car, or that the test of a scientific fact would change from, is it true, to will it get me anywhere? During the expansive post-war years, she continued, the high priests of the youngest science set forth to save the world by making it psychological. American professors, quote, eager to save democracy through their tests and tabulations, decided that the new psychology should be as practical and helpful as the new physics. Like the physical inventor with his power over electricity, psychological inventors with their powers over the human mind expanded on subjects ranging from A to Z as reflected in the titles of some of their books. She gave a huge list, but I'll just I'll just list some of them here: athletics, arithmetic, alcoholism, beauty, buying, Bolshevism, business success, Christian life, citizenship, coaching, death, dress, fasting, golf, group insurance, Jesus, leadership, learning, marriage, murder, package labels, the poet Shelley, selling life insurance, and the psychology of your name. That psychology was increasingly equated with the ability to manipulate others was manifested in Dale Carnegie's bestseller published in 1936, How to Win Friends and Influence People. In the 1920s, academic psychologists were already wary of the army of charlatans parading their wares, promising to improve memory, enhance personality, or tell character. University of Manitoba psychologist Henry Wright castigated them as unscrupulous spellbinders who traveled from city to city, offering in the name of psychology to drive forth the demons of disease and unhappiness for monetary compensation. Psychologists were primarily concerned about popular interest in the sensational, suggestion, hypnotism, spiritualism, extrasensory perception, and telepathy. The existence of these phenomena was confirmed for many of the public by the invention of the wireless. Led by Marconi in the early 1920s, there were efforts to communicate not only with the other side, but by radio with other planets, especially Mars. Psychologists of the 1920s were faced with a dilemma. The public held psychology in high regard, regarding it as a science with practical applications, said U of T psychologist J.W. Bridges. But when it failed to provide panaceas, pseudoscience stepped in, and psychology grew in popularity as a study of psychic phenomena. Desire to communicate with the spirit world, already a 19th century phenomenon, escalated because of wartime bereavement. Nearly 61,000 Canadian soldiers, primarily the nation's youth, were killed in the war, with thousands more wounded. In 1917, more than 1,600 Nova Scotians died when a munition ship exploded in Halifax Harbor. Through 1918-19, the influenza epidemic killed 50,000 people in Canada. For McGill, there were financial and psychological effects. Enrollment declined as 2,500 of its students and 90 faculty enlisted in the armed services. 522 were killed and 314 were wounded in action. In the fall of 1918, the university had to shut its doors for 6 weeks when influenza cases reached epidemic proportions in Montreal. And as the death rate rose, schools, theaters, and law courts were all closed by civic order. After the war, a wave of psychic literature appeared. The 20th Plane, a psychic revelation, published in 1918, presented psychical research undertaken by a Canadian, Albert Durant Watson. An overnight sensation, it had accounts of famous figures such as Martin Luther and Abraham Lincoln delivering trance addresses through a local medium. The public's appetite for tales of psychic phenomena was also aided by the public proclamations and addresses of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes novels, whose speeches on spiritism given to large audiences in Canada, including Montreal, the United States, Britain, and elsewhere, drew wide attention through newspaper coverage. Conan Doyle and Oliver Lodge, whose book Raymond, or Life and Death, published in 1919, prompted belief in the possibility of communicating with soldiers killed in the war by means of seances, as they claimed they had done with their own sons. But they were only the most famous exponents of modern spiritualism after World War I. That's a slide that Conan Doyle had put up of a materialization of his son in a seance. Resurgence of popular interest in the occult was matched only in the 1920s by psychologists' efforts to stamp it out. In 1920, Arthur Stanley Eve, MacDonald Professor and Chair of the Department of Physics at McGill, who was a distinguished scientist made Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work directing secret submarine detection research, spoke to the Women's Canadian Club at Montreal's Ritz-Carlton Hotel. He told the Lodge audience there that the utterances of Lodge, Doyle, and others on Spiritism did not rest on scientific evidence, but were products of an excess of inspiration, defect of critical faculty, and their personal grievous bereavement. In the 1920s, city officials and law courts wrestled with Spiritism's status. Was it a science, trade, or calling that fell within the purview of city bylaws requiring practitioners to obtain a license? The question was debated in the Superior Court of Montreal regarding practitioners who had been fined $25 for illegally exercising the profession of Spiritism without a license. A female petitioner argued that Spiritism was not a trade but a science and therefore did not require a city license. In 1921, Chief Judge DeCarey heard a case in Montreal's Court of Special Sessions involving a woman who had been embezzled by a hypnotist, claiming he could use telepathic suggestion to get truant husbands, such as hers, to love their wives. DeCarey declared that he did not believe in telepathic suggestion at all and considered it an immense fake. Now, I focused here on the local scene in Montreal, but efforts to deal with psychic belief were widespread. As leading American experimental psychologist Joseph Jastrow noted, in the closing decades of the 19th century, psychical research was so prominent that in medical circles, a psychologist meant a spook hunter. And in December 1926, a symposium entitled "The Case For and Against Psychic Belief," held at Clark University in Worcester in December, featured papers by prominent scientists and social scientists. Houdini was scheduled to participate, but died beforehand. He had earlier given a lecture in Montreal dispelling Spiritism, where he was introduced by William Tate. In the 1930s, psychologists' battle with the popularizers continued. Writing about luck for the Canadian Credit Institute, University of Alberta psychologist John MacDonald explained that magic and modern science both arose from uncertainty. Science sought to control events by discovering their causes and using experiments. Magic was a shortcut, a human trick pretending to accomplish the required result. Grace Adams noted, "The public expected psychologists, a scientist, to exercise the same kind of magic on the human mind that surgeons worked upon the human body. But the Depression of the 1930s showed that the psychology could not offer miracle cures." During the 1930s, at McGill, Chester Kellogg worked to dispel popular misconceptions about psychology by disproving claims for the existence of telepathy and extrasensory perception arising from the work of J.B. Rhine. Rhine had precipitated a major controversy that reverberated in statistics and psychology and then captured wider public attention when his book, New Frontiers of the Mind, published in 1937, was widely heralded as the selection of the Book of the Month Club. The book presented the results of investigations that Rhine had been undertaking at Duke University on ESP and clairvoyance since 1930. This is Rhine with Hubert Pierce, who was a Methodist ministerial student at Duke, who claimed that family members of his had clairvoyant abilities. Many psychologists published critiques of Rhine's experiments in academic journals, but no one was more prolific in that regard than Kellogg, who tested Rhine's results through experiments in his own lab at McGill. Now, some description of Rhine's work is called for. Throughout the 1930s, Rhine, a botanist who had established a parapsychology lab at Duke, as well as the Journal of Parapsychology in 1937, tested many students as volunteer subjects for ESP in card guessing games. These games involved a pack of 25 cards named Zener cards. There's the original package from the Duke University archives. And here's an example of the Zener cards. Each bore one of 5 designs on its face: a circle, a rectangle, star, cross, or set of wavy lines. And each design was on 5 cards in a pack. Once a subject was made familiar with the designs and the pack shuffled, An experimenter turned the cards up in order with the face of each card concealed from the subject, who then had to name the symbol on as many cards as possible without looking at them. A certain percentage of success was expected by chance, and on average, 1 card right for every 5. The goal was to determine whether anyone could name enough cards to prove that something more than chance or luck was at work. A significant percentage of successes was considered evidence of telepathy or clairvoyance. And this is a 1940 Life magazine cover photo of Edith Howell, who was then a psychology student at Duke doing the Zener card experiment. She went on to become a faculty member in the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health for more than 50 years and was director of the Bureau of Chronic Diseases of the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And this is a frame from the movie Ghostbusters, where they do the Zener card experiment. The results of Rhine's experiments were claimed to be amazing. A score of men and women regularly named so many of the cards correctly that there was not one chance in many millions that it was by luck or accident. But Kellogg was skeptical. He had become acquainted with a scientific approach to parapsychology as a member of Munster graduates in 1913. Reports of his psychic research investigations at Stanford that also involved treatment of numerical data dealing with card-playing experiments like Rhine's. Coover found no occult power. The public's ardor for card guessing had diminished after that, but then a psychic test undertaken by Oliver Lodge in 1927 with the BBC's assistant went awry. Radio listeners, numbering in the millions, were invited to guess to guess what objects several peoples locked in a room overnight were shown. There were 25,000 replies, mostly wrong, newspapers screamed. Rhine's studies, however, revived popular interest when he and his Duke associates conducted more than 100,000 card tests. Kellogg was dismayed that publicity from Rhine's claims had stimulated further investigations and that the founding of the Journal of Parapsychology had diverted young men and women in vital years of training into a side issue with funding, he said, that could have supported research on topics of real social significance. He recognized that popularizers had fostered public appreciation of science as germane to human welfare, something that research published into the difficult language of professional journals could never achieve, but was startled when the chairman of the Department of English Literature at Columbia, Professor Ernest Wright, became another recruit to Rhine's ranks. Wright had decided, based on Rhine's preliminary studies, that existence of clairvoyance and telepathy had been established, and wrote 2 famous articles for Harper's Magazine in 1936, presenting proof. The results were sweeping generalities based on a few striking cases that had public appeal, but proved nothing, Kellogg charged. Kellogg believed in quantitative techniques and conducted experiments with card tests at McGill because he considered Rhine's work an example of bad methods and conclusions unsupported by data. Once the truth was out, he thought the card test craze would subside. Through his own experiments at McGill, Kellogg found that Rhine's basic error resulted in his argument on a supposed difference between the test's actual results and those that occurred by chance. In each of Rhine's packs, over 623 trillion different arrangements were possible, making tabulation and comparison beyond human capacity. The test undertaken at McGill during the academic year in 1937, using higher mathematical methods, explained why ordinary methods yielded higher scores. Instead of publishing complete reports of scores from his experiments, Rhine selected only the more fortunate results. This led Kellogg to observe, "The unusual always attracts attention and is the source of mystery." He then recounted a hand he once had in bridge, consisting of all the spades in the pack. Something that could be expected, he said, only once in 737,580,160 times. I don't play bridge, but if any of you do, you could let me know whether these figures seem right. Since the same was true for every hand, Kellogg continued, it meant that in card guessing, a perfect score was no more rare than many other ways of getting an average score. Ryan underestimated the chances for higher scores, paid no attention to internal inconsistencies in results, and chose portions of evidence that assumed the truth of the theory he sought to prove from the outset. Rather than abide impartially by the results of his experiments, Kellogg charged, Ryan published only data that confirmed the belief he had in ESP, though Kellogg also thought that Ryan had been misinformed by mathematicians he'd consulted regarding techniques. U of T psychologists, SF Chant, applauded Kellogg for exposing the elusiveness of the theory of probability in his experiments. Ryan calculated the most likely number of correct calls that would occur according to chance, and then compared his subjects' calls with this prediction, Chant said. Kellogg's bridge example showed that probability could cut both ways. Anything may happen, and invariably, it is the unusual. In bridge, there are millions of chances against getting any single bridge hand, and yet getting some kind of bridge hand is an ordinary experience. Because anything may happen by chance, to claim an occurrence does not happen by chance requires a statement of why it did happen. And instead of meeting that scientific requirement, Chant said, Ryan postulated a power of clairvoyance or telepathy. This was like saying that music comes from a radio because there are little men inside who sing and play. When the question is raised as to how we know the men are in there, we are told that they must be there because we can hear them. It is telling that psychologists devoted so much attention to disproving the results of card guessing experiments in the 1930s. Exposing fraud was their motive, but they were also reckoning with probability and the role of chance. Chance appealed to reason, which underlay his sarcastic reference to how sound came out of a radio, also hints that it was inventions like the wireless that underlay so much of the public's belief in the sensational. One fruitful source of research funding for some psychologists was the business community. Lectures by psychologists attracting large audiences were sponsored by Montreal businesses. McGill psychologists also developed a revision of the Army beta examination, that is to say, intelligence tests for those with limited literacy, to measure ability in skills and trades and to help college authorities place students and assist employers. Two of Montreal's largest companies employing thousands of people, one of them Sun Life Assurance, introduced psychological testing into their personnel departments. Other businesses undertook extensive studies of guidance, personnel management, time work management, treatment of mental illness, juvenile delinquency, methods of child rearing, and subconscious selling and advertising. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, large businesses in Montreal and Toronto hired psychologists not only for placement purposes, but for dealing with customers who fell behind in deferred payments or for reviewing and reconstructing advertising methods. This activity reached a crescendo in 1935 when executive officers in Montreal's largest firms met weekly to discuss the benefits of industrial psychology, which resulted in the creation of the Montreal and Toronto Personnel Associations and included representatives from Bell, Eaton, Simpsons, the CNR, the CPR, Sun Life Assurance, CIL, and Dominion Tire and Rubber. They were influenced by the formation of similar associations in northeastern United States from 1912 onwards, and publicity given to Harvard researcher Elton Mayo's studies in industrial psychology in the mid-1930s. Another impetus was that 1935 was the year in which John L. Lewis and his followers left the American Federation of Labor to form the more radical Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO. It was against the backdrop of all these developments that Rockefeller Foundation funds came to McGill, with Charles Meredith Hinks, founder of the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, playing an instrumental role. I covered this extensively in other publications, so I'm just generalizing here. Hinks, a psychiatrist and physician, had introduced intelligence testing in Ontario schools, was a medical inspector for the Toronto Department of Health, and with Dr. C.K. Clark, opened the first psychiatric clinic in Canada. Described by one journalist as, quote, the only generalissimo who could lead economics and applied physical and chemical sciences, education and preventive medicine and the social sciences in the vitally necessary struggle for a resurrected civilization. Hinks cultivated personal contacts with Rockefeller Foundation trustees who regarded him as the individual who could put their objectives into practice in Canada. In the 1920s, the Rockefeller Foundation turned its primary focus from funding medical schools to promoting research on immigration policies, human relations in industry and education, and problems stemming from unemployment, delinquency, and dependency. Hinks worked with McGill's Dean of Medicine, Dr. Charles Martin, to obtain the Rockefeller Grant for McGill. The foundation envisioned that McGill would create something along the lines of the University of Chicago or Yale's interdisciplinary social research projects. Hinks hoped, in turn, that success in obtaining a grant for social research at McGill would stimulate developments in those fields across Canada. McGill appealed to the Rockefeller Foundation because it was, they thought, a university with a national outlook, a private corporation, quote, unfettered by the strictures of government control, and its close cooperation with the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene would facilitate the contacts with governments, industrialists, and other organizations necessary for research and the practical application. Trustees also was advantageous because social science, because as they thought, and less bound by tradition than other countries. With the grant achieved, the McGill social scientists chose to focus the research of the project on topics of unemployment, preferring to call it employment, and immigration in Montreal, because these lent themselves to an interdisciplinary approach that would include professors from several departments, and because Montreal was an industrial city with a multitude of ethnic groups, manufacturing plants, seaport associations, and pronounced seasonal unemployment, meaning that it had a cross-section of Canadian life not found elsewhere. Under the umbrella of the Social Science Research Project, McGill psychologists worked on industrial psychology and the vocational guidance of so-called maladjusted adults. They also undertook extensive comparative studies of unemployed and employed men and boys during the Depression years. At McGill, as at the U of T, Rockefeller Foundation funds were also channeled to psychology for the establishment of a nursery school and a child center to enable longitudinal studies that would provide insights on conditions ensuring the adjustment of individuals to society. Child Center did not thrive at McGill, but at the U of T, it became the Institute of Child Study, the first of such institutes in North America. When the Social Science Research Project's topic of unemployment was proposed in 1930, the Great Depression was not top of mind. Seasonal unemployment, a chronic problem in Montreal, was the focus. By January 1931, when the project got underway, however, unemployment was widespread in the city and throughout the world. McGill was not immune. There were serious budget deficits and salary reductions. And within a few years, as the social science research studies were published as books, they drew the ire of McGill officials who fought many battles against what they perceived as political radicalism during the 1930s. They watched carefully the activities of the League for Social Reconstruction members, were alarmed at the attachment of Christianity to socialist or what they perceived as Marxist principles, eased King Gordon out of the United Theological College, and redefined tenure and promotion policies so as to rid the university of individuals like political economist Eugene Forsey. The author of the official history of McGill, Stanley Frost, stated that the Social Science Research Project was a greater embarrassment to the Board of Governors because it was conceived and sponsored by the university itself. He also commented that the studies, published as books with such titles as Employment Research, Industrial Diagnosis, The Railway Worker, and The British Immigrant, gave the appearance of being more socialistic than they were, especially since each was several hundred pages to those who knew them only by title. In addition to the dissatisfaction of McGill officials, other problems festered for social science research. By the late 1930s, the mental hygiene connection to psychology was eroding. At U of T, Bott grew increasingly resentful that its agenda was determining the shape of psychological research. The Rockefeller Foundation decided that, given the Depression, funds would be better allocated for the solution of immediate economic problems, as in banking, and the McGill officials made it known that they did not want the social science research funding to continue. So as participants in this interdisciplinary research project, McGill psychologists found themselves embroiled in the administration's fears that the university was turning into a center of social ferment with its locus in the social science research project. By the end of the 1930s, the grant was terminated, and Leonard Marsh, who had been hired from Britain to direct it, was let go. He later was involved in the federal government's post-war reconstruction plan and wrote Social Security for Canada. I'll conclude with 2 points. The first is that with the lancing of the social sciences at McGill in the 1930s, people and ideas were drummed out with the result that when we study Canadian intellectual currents today, we don't perceive all there once was. When John Porter wrote The Vertical Mosaic in the 1960s, he was unaware of Leonard Marsh's book, Canadians in and Out of Work, published in 1940, which was a compendium of the McGill social science research investigations, revealing vast discrepancies in wealth and income that separated Canadians, and used the same metaphor as Porter to make the point. The second is to underline the significant public presence that academic psychology era the enormous role that the Great War had played in fostering the public's interest in psychology, and why some of that public associated it with psychic phenomena. In what clearly had become a world of uncertainty, the desire to control human events seemed natural. More than one psychologist observed at the time that magic and science were alike in their objectives. In a sense, then, psychology and the occult were two sides of the same coin. They originated in a struggle with one another in the late 19th century, and tensions persisted through the first decades of the 20th. That tension between seemingly irreconcilable forces and ideas was part and parcel of modernism. Many historians now recognize that Western modernity is characterized not by disenchantment, but by enchantment. And as British historian Michael Saylor has noted, the specters that haunted North America and Europe in the late 19th and 20th century, magicians, mesmerists, invisible worlds, and interest in the irrational, were part of a Janus phase modernity.